Hi, everyone. I'm Ivo Dalder, President of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and this is World Review, a weekly look at news from around the world. Joining us this week is Julian Barnes, National Security Reporter of the New York Times. Julian, wonderful to have you.
Thanks for having me on.
And Karen DeYoung, Associate Editor and Senior National Security Correspondent for the Washington Post. Karen, wonderful to have you back.
Great to be here.
And Stefan, Kornelius, who is the foreign editor of the German daily, the Süddeutsche Zeitung. Stefan, very nice to have you back as well.
Good to see you.
Well, let's start with you, Stefan, on Belarus. Major protests in the streets in Minsk and other parts of Belarus following a election that is widely seen as having been stolen by Europe's last dictator, as President Lukashenko is well known, and a reaction coming from Europe with a special meeting of the European Council just this week. What is the status of the discussion inside Belarus, and how is Europe starting to react to the reality that we have another part of Europe where major protests are taking place?
Well, inside Belarus, we are facing another week of protests. There are demonstrations announced for this coming Sunday. It seems that Lukashenko, the dictator, has regained a bit of control, especially with the help of Russia, which sent experts mostly for media communication, but also to run industries which are on strike. There is a still standoff. The opposition today voiced its demand for another election, or at least some kind of roundtable debate where things can be sorted. The European Union is under extreme pressure. This is a huge conflict at its doorstep, sort of comparable to what we saw in Ukraine 2013 and the following years, where Russia intervened and we saw the cessation of Crimea and a war in eastern Ukraine. This time definitely is different because Belarus is not split. Belarus is a country which is highly close emotionally and politically and to Russia. And it's not about getting closer to Europe. It's about having a fair election and escaping this kind of dictatorship of Lukashenko. So Europe is trying to walk a fine line between putting pressure on Lukashenko and at the same time making clear that this is not sort of a revolutionary business. We do share in the purpose of having a new member of the European Union.
Karen, what has been the reaction in Washington? Secretary Pompeo was in Europe last week, and I don't think he spent a lot of time talking about this issue. But what is the debate in Washington? This is another major upheaval in a part of the world that used to preoccupy Americans more than it appears to be these days.
Well, I think that the first thing to say is that nobody, the Europeans or the Americans and the Russians, nobody wants to or intends to go to war over Belarus. I think that it's a lot of posturing at this point. The Europeans, as Stefan said, have made strong statements. They have redirected some of their aid to go to the opposition instead of the government. They already had sanctions. They have said they're going to strengthen them. I think the Americans at this point are just sort of saying, yes, we agree, and not really doing very much about it. You have the Russians who have said, Putin has said, yes, we support Lukashenko, but it's not clear whether they're going to do anything that would actually provoke a stronger reaction as they did in Ukraine from either the Europeans or the Americans.
Julian, what's the intelligence community looking at when they look at Belarus, and particularly also on whether they're seeing signs that the Russians may or may not be intervening
it's not going to look like the Cold War style stuff, right? That kind of Russian intervention where tanks roll into Hungary or Czechoslovakia is over. It's more like what we would see in Ukraine, where the little green men come. And so that's what people are on the lookout for. I don't think we've seen anything that, from what I've heard, that they think that Moscow thinks that's necessary at this point. And if Russia was to do something like that, the options for both Europe, the United States, NATO are even more limited than they were in Ukraine, for all the reasons that Karen and Stefan have laid out. There's not an appetite for it. There's not an ability, and the Belarusian people are asking for something different here, and so that's why there's at least hope that this stays on the sort of political pressure, diplomatic pressure from both sides.
Stefan, earlier this week, before the European Council met, Merkel got on the phone to Putin, Macron got on the phone to Putin, Michel got on the phone to Putin. What was the message that they were sending him? Was it just a negative one and says, don't intervene? Or was it another one that says, can you help us out? Or what was the conversation there?
Well, they all know they're Putin, so basically the conversation was twofold. First, warning: overstep it. Don't do stupid things like intervening militarily. And we also watch you on all the shadowy things you're doing, all the murky or hybrid options Russia does have and uses regularly. And the second issue is don't use us as a pretext for intervention. This is not our turf. We are sort of respecting your zone of influence. This is sort of Putin speak, zone of influence. This is what he wants. He wants Belarus as a buffer zone. And he definitely doesn't want Belarus falling into the camp of the West. And that would basically mean democratization. Belarus becoming a democracy, another color revolution. That's the nightmare of the Kremlin. And we saw in the previous weeks in Eastern Russia, in Siberia and other places, we did see unrest. We did see people being not happy with the government, mostly for economic reasons and due to the COVID crisis. And so Putin has all right to fear that this virus might spread to his own turf. And so the EU wants to make sure that they're not getting the blame for it.
Not getting blamed for it, but at the same time, Karen, not really resolving the issue. What's missing is kind of a strategy, it seems to me, that we used to have to say, what is our goal here and how are we going to go about to achieve it? It seems to me more a negative step. Let's not have this further deteriorate where a military intervention by Russia may be necessitated. What happens inside the country is something for the people themselves to decide. And yes, we would like to have maybe a new election, but really don't want to go further than that. Is there? Do you see a strategy here that hasn't become clear yet?
No, I mean, I think that in terms of the United States and Europe, they're not strategizing very closely together on much of anything these days. I think that people are in a watching and waiting mode. As Stefan said, this is not over. We want to join the West versus we want to get closer to Russia. You see people. The interesting thing about the demonstrations is you've got Belarus as one of those few sort of post-Soviet countries where most of the means of production are still state-owned, and therefore most people who work there work for the state. And yet even those people have come out in the street. And so I think that as the West watches and waits, the question is, what's the staying power of those people? How long are they going to stay out there? And as Russia, as the panelists have said, watches this, how long are they willing to let it go on? And how do they balance their equities in terms of once again intervening as they did in Ukraine, and or trying to, as Julian said, kind of under the surface, try to get this settled down. So I don't think I don't think there is a strategy from the West now to do anything about it. They want to wait and see what happens.
Judith mentioned the worry in Moscow about the color revolution spreading, given what's happening already in the East. Of course, one of those worries was demonstrated just in the last day or so when one of the chief opposition figures inside Russia, Alexander
Navalny.
was on a trip back from the East, and apparently poisoned, and is now unconscious in a Russian hospital. Where did that come from, and is this a sign of worry, do you think, in Moscow about what is happening in terms of the opposition?
I mean, I don't know if we should take this as a sign of worry by Putin so much as a target of opportunity. Navalny had not traveled recently as widely. This was a rare trip out of Moscow to Siberia to build up the opposition. And you know, so the act may be totally separate from what we saw in Minsk. However, this goes to the same paranoia that Putin or any authoritarian dictator has, which is to, you know, tamp down the opposition, eliminate them before they get get traction. And you know, poison the tea of any opposition, any defector who is starting to gain some momentum. So I mean, this is a terrible development. It's also terrible that they do not appear to be letting Navalny out of Russia for treatment in Germany. And this is the kind of thing where you need a little more clear pressure from the United States to even on the very narrow issue of medical care. I mean, we can't just have Germany and the European Union alone getting his release. I mean, this is the kind of thing where in another administration, you would have heard the United States speak with a more clear voice.
Karen, the president yesterday announced that Mike Pompeo was going to take care of it. And that's, I think, the extent of the statements, although the National Security Advisor came out this morning and said that Navalny was an important figure and needed to be protected. But we haven't seen much beyond that, have we?
No, I think the president, the president has a habit. He did this yesterday with the Iraqi president. He was asked about something that he didn't care about and didn't know a whole lot about, sitting in the Oval Office, and immediately turned to Pompeo, who was sitting there on the couch, and said, well, Mike, basically, what do we think about this? So I think that, they're very preoccupied, obviously. They're preoccupied with the elections. They're preoccupied with the pandemic. And if you add that to President Trump's kind of normal disinclination to point the finger at Putin as the first order of business, I think that it is sort of shocking in a way. And as you say, in previous years or previous administrations, I think there would have been some sort of stronger stand. There would have been an attempt to coordinate a response with the Europeans, but once again, you see that they're not getting out in front of this. Whether it's because of a lack of bandwidth or a disinclination really to point the finger.
Stefan, of course, in Europe, there is the focus on it, and in Germany, and specifically with already the outside help of medical care and a possible airplane. What's Chancellor Merkel doing? This is an issue that she and the relationship she has with Putin at times can be used to try to resolve this kind of issue, at least address it. What are you hearing from Berlin?
Well, the Navalny case is extremely special. This is the most prominent opposition figure. If he's being targeted, this is not by accident or by some rogue KGB guy or some local crony who wants to do him harm. This has to have the highest blessings. So we can assume that if there is foul game, then Putin is involved. Merkel has only limited options, and Julian was referring to it, that it's the same in Belarus, that the hands are bound, that other than economic pressure, there's not much to apply. Putin definitely has no interest in mending the fences with Europe. We are not sort of on speaking terms at all. He knows that it's now about his idea of sort of an order or a disorder, or about the European order, European democracy model, which is definitely alien to his style of governing. This is a huge systemic clash, and it plays out both in Belarus and both in the Navalny case. The government sends a plane. They want to check on Navalny, and definitely it can be proved that he was poisoned, but only probably in a neutral space, in a neutral hospital, and somewhere in Germany.
Well, we will come back to these issues, and no doubt in the weeks ahead. But let's switch course on another area where the United States and Europe are not looking eye to eye, Karen, and that's the question of Iran, where we used to have the U.S. and the Europeans working closely together, but now we have a very surreal clash between we're a party to since we walked out of it in 2018. What's the exact issue here that is playing out in New York these days, and where do you see this heading?
Well, in many ways, this is kind of a chronicle of a death foretold. I think that what this is specifically about is a part of the Iran nuclear deal, which everyone refers to as the JCPOA, that prevented Iran from buying or selling conventional weapons. It's not about nuclear weapons, it's about other weapons. And so there had been sanctions on Iran for conventional weapons since the mid-2000s. Part of the nuclear deal was that these particular sanctions, would be lifted after 5 years. And those 5 years are up the middle of October. So the question was, should they be extended? Nobody really wants Iran to be able to buy more weaponry or to distribute weaponry, but it's mostly about buying. And so the Trump administration said, well, this is ridiculous. And they put a resolution forward in the UN saying, we think that all sanctions, because Iran has violated the deal, all sanctions should be snapped back into place. And there was a provision in the deal that this would happen if Iran violated it. The Europeans have tried to concentrate just on this provision for conventional weapons and say the United States is using it as an excuse to basically bring the hammer down altogether on Iran, which really would mean the end of the deal. They say the United States has no say over this because, in fact, it withdrew from the deal in 2018. So the Americans put forward a resolution in the Security Council last week that said, well, snap back, all sanctions go back on Iran. And they got one vote out of 15 members besides their own. And that was the Dominican Republic, which I think the quid pro quo was that Secretary Pompeo would travel to the Dominican Republic kind of out of nowhere to attend the inauguration of their president, which he in fact did the other day. So this resolution failed. The Europeans had, argued that, look, we can persuade the Russians and Chinese, who are also parties to the deal, that they can that they will agree to an extension of this arms sanction. So let's do that. And the Americans said, nope, not going to work. We're not going to do that. So having lost this resolution, Pompeo went to New York yesterday to inform the Security Council that, in fact, they were implementing the snapback, the reimposition of all sanctions against Iran that were lifted as part of the nuclear deal. He gave a really fiery speech, which was pretty insulting to the Europeans. I mean, he said they were siding with the Ayatollahs. He said that they were being foolish. And so I think that this sort of took a lot of the Europeans back, even agree that something should be done about the weapon sales. But as they say, the only people who are benefiting from this are China and Russia, who basically don't pay any attention to sanctions anyway. And the Chinese are already sending weapons to Russians, and nothing much is going to change under this. The US case is that the UN resolution several years ago that was the implementing document for the international community for the deal, for the nuclear deal, said that any participants could snap back all the sanctions. And this was a provision that was basically put in case the Iranians went back to trying to develop a nuclear weapon. Nobody ever imagined that the people in the West would actually try to do this. The Americans waved around a legal interpretation from the State Department that said, yes, participants means anybody who was there at the time this resolution was adopted. The Europeans had their own legal opinions that said, no, it means participants, people in the deal. You're not in the deal anymore, therefore you don't have a say. So that's sort of where things stand. The Americans say that they're going to implement this within 30 days. The Europeans say this is ridiculous, you can't do this, and besides, it won't accomplish anything. We've already pulled out of Iran because you have unilateral sanctions on Iran, not international sanctions, you, the United States, that have made it difficult to be there. It's not going to affect us. What it's going to do is basically increase ties between Iran, Russia, and China. And most importantly, and more long-lastingly, it's going to go some distance to destroying the Security Council. So that's sort of where things stand right now.
Stefan, Europeans are sometimes divided, but on the issue of Iran, Germany, the UK, and France have been united from almost the very beginning, back in the early 2000s, when approach to negotiating has been started on this issue. They remain united. How are they looking at the Washington efforts, and what impact is this having on America, views of America in Europe?
Well, it's probably the final, or sort of the most visible or most impactful demonstration of how bad that split is, how bad transatlantic relations really are. It's proof of the total breakdown of diplomacy as we knew it. Definitely, there's no one in Europe who wants the weapons embargo now this fall to end and wants Iran to gain access to those weapons. But nevertheless, the way Pompeo just takes the JCPOA as he likes it, or as he deems fit for the moment, is so unpredictable and so sort of such an affront to the European side that for the moment they have decided to join those really weird alliance now with China and Russia against the US, which is a huge a blow to what we all thought was in our alliance. But here we are. It's a breakdown of diplomacy, and this happens if no one really talks and plans jointly and makes decisions jointly. And I mean, Karen was describing brilliantly the details of the program, but the baseline for me is we are not finding common ground on this anymore.
intelligence community and other communities that you look at closely on what the Iranians are likely to do of this breakdown of relationship between the two most important sides that forged, after all, the deal. Iranian behavior.
So, I mean, it is a complicated question here. I have talked to a number of officials who, before this said the tug of war in the Iranian planning is between those who want to just sit and wait for a change in administrations in Washington, and those who want to sort of try to put a foot down to try to force regime change in America, to try to interrupt the world stage in some ways that undermines Donald Trump. The problem is the Iranians can't really do anything like that, especially their greatest disruptive card is to interrupt the sort of world economy, which is already, because of this pandemic, in disarray and in a terrible state. So this move, though, where Europe and the United States are so far apart and the United States is so isolated, could present an opening for Iran. And of course, what if they overplay their hand there? What if they are overconfident here in trying to play the division between Washington and Europe? And so exactly what the next Iranian move vis-a-vis Washington is unclear. Part of the issue here is, after the Soleimani strike, there is the risk of overconfidence by the United States that Pompeo and Trump and others who advocated for the strike on the Quds Force leader, that they believe a tough line to Tehran will not be met with a reaction, and that this can play out both on the diplomatic stage and on a military stage. And so that is a danger when we get into a moment of high tension like we are now.
Can I think it's important, Ivo, to say on this issue and on all of these issues that we've discussed, everybody is watching the US elections. I think that people are holding their breath, saying, well, if it's 4 more years of Trump, we really need to recalculate and see what it is we're going to do. You look at the Biden platform, he said he will go back to Iran and reformulate the deal. He will go back and strengthen ties with Europeans. So I think that there is, this Iran issue has kind of forced it a bit, because you do have this deadline. And so the breach may deepen, but in terms of something actually happening, there's not much time for something to actually happen. And so everybody's in this weird sort of let's wait and see what happens kind of position at the moment.
This is a great to our next topic, and Julian, you've been writing a lot about it in the past week. The intelligence community came out a couple of weeks ago to warn Americans about the possible, in the likely and continuing intervention by the Russians, the Chinese, the Iranians in the elections in the United States. And in the midst of this, a bipartisan report signed by Republicans and Democratic senators of the Intelligence Committee was plopped, because it's big, almost 1,000 pages on the table, with some pretty remarkable findings with regard to what Russia was up to back in 2016. What did you see that was new and from what we didn't quite know about the story so far, other than the bipartisan nature of the conclusions?
I mean, number one, what you just said is really, really important, that this is a bipartisan report. The facts laid out in this report had the backings of both Democrats and Republicans. And that's not something that we've seen when we're talking about Russian interference. We've seen litigation over basic facts. Now, we still here on this report had some disagreement about the interpretation, what it all added up to. But the power of this report is the information about Russian interference in 2016. Now, we've been over this territory a lot. The Mueller report was very extensive. The Washington Post, the New York Times, other publications have been reporting about this throughout 2017 with minute detail. But in this report, we got some things stated with more authority and more clarity than before, that, you know, it is worth people diving in and reading. We had for the a statement that Paul Manafort's business partner, Konstantin Kilimnik, was a Russian intelligence officer. That was clearly stated in this report. Kilimnik is, of course, the person that Paul Manafort gave the polling data to in 2016. And, you know, as senators pointed out, this is if the blueprint, the roadmap of an election. Like, it would tell the Russians, you know, where do you put your efforts in 2016? It would tell the Russians, for example, that, you know, Trump saw an opening in Wisconsin or Pennsylvania. And so that's where their social media information could be focused. So there was new information about Paul Manafort. And then there was also new information about WikiLeaks. You know, we've known for a long time about the hack and dump. But this Senate report said very clearly that WikiLeaks likely knew that they were getting Russian information. And then it outlined with a lot of detail the calls between Roger Stone and Donald Trump. Now, Donald Trump has said, and Roger Stone has said, that they either didn't recall or did not talk about WikiLeaks. And the Senate report, the bipartisan Senate report, called them out on that and said that simply they didn't believe that. And that the Trump and Stone knew about the WikiLeaks, talked about the WikiLeaks. And what's important here too is after October 7th, 2016, the Trump campaign was put on notice by intelligence officials that that information had been stolen by Russia. And yet they still went ahead and used it. And that's what's really sort of, in my mind, damning about this report. It shows, maybe it does not prove collusion, whatever that means, but it shows that members of the Trump campaign cooperated with Russians. And that's very powerful.
Stefan, aside from the details and the specifics in terms of how it played out in internal US politics, this idea of Russia using the powers of the state to really try to undermine and shape an election outcome, not just of any country, but of the United States. How is that perceived in Europe? Or what worry does that have for the integrity of European elections? And what does it say about the adversary that Russia represents to Europe more generally and to democracies more generally?
I think we know now for so many years that Russia under Putin is a revisionist power, a power which wants to restore its old might. And to do this, it needs to weaken powers which it sees as its adversaries. And this is definitely the European Union and the United States. And in both cases, Russia seems to succeed partially. Europe is split over its perception of Russia, whether it is now a threat or whether it can be handled. Germany is split about it in terms of its votes here and about the popular opinion. But nevertheless, in the end, I think we have to face the fact that this is a country which is doing us harm. And any attempt to come to terms with Putin usually end up in disappointment and failure. because he is lying and he's not sticking to his words. Well, there are interests, there are weak spots he has, mostly economic, mostly in selling his resources, energy. But then in the end, this problem can only be solved if we do have a systemic change, if Russia is no longer governed the way it is. And this is probably in the end up to the Russian people. To me, the impact of the report we saw this week is also sort of another one, sort of the flip side is interesting. To me, it points to the weakness of America and to the weakness, to the fact that the US seems to be sort of seen from those countries, also China and others, like a corpse which can be vultured, and like sort of a country which is not defending itself anymore. And that it is sort of possible that you can intervene in the domestic affairs in such a basic and impactful way. I mean, there is a clear interest in Russia to have Donald Trump stay in power because it's helpful for Russia. And this, in the flip side, points to the lack of consensus in the United States about the most simplest things. There used to be a consensus about how to read China, how to read Russia. That's no longer the case.
Karen, a corpse that is being vultured, to use Stefan's an image that is
stark.
But you know, the report is out, the warnings are out, the intelligence community has warned. How confident should Americans be that this time around the U.S. government is going to prevent that kind of intervention and deal with it right now?
You know, there have been things put in place, the cyber blocks, they're calling it out more, but I think the administration itself is still fixated on kind of the sort of no hoax, no collusion in 2016. You see that in the president's tweets. You see it in the Senate Justice Committee investigation of, again, of what happened in 2016. And I think that there's some fear that they're so focused on that perhaps they're not paying enough attention to this. I mean, there's a whole separate school of thought that says that, you know, yes, it's happening. Yes, it's terrible, but the evidence that it's actually going to affect the election is not huge. I don't think there's been a sort of Julian might know more than I do about this. I don't think there's a real consensus on that. I mean, I thought one of the most interesting things about this report was yes, it did, as Julian said, make some very specific, much more specific than the Mueller report, conclusions about Manafort and his interactions with Russian intelligence about the WikiLeaks hacks and distribution of information. But it also, I mean, it basically is saying that there was, in not concluding that there was collusion, it doesn't say that that's because the Trump campaign didn't want to do it. It just said they were pretty inept at it, and they just kind of were too sort of callow and inexperienced to really use it as much as they could have and coordinate with the sources of the interference and the information as much as they could have. So I just found that was kind of shocking. Among the many shocking things in this report, but I think in terms of what's happening now, you know, I think people are much more focused on what the post office is doing than what the Russians are doing.
Yeah, in many ways, the way the situation is playing out. Let's shift gears to Stefan. Another reason why the European Council came together, an emergency session was for Belarus, but the opportunity was raised to deal with another really pressing issue confronting Europe and the world, which is the confrontation between Turkey and Greece in the Eastern Mediterranean over gas. And I must say, I read the conclusions from the European Council meeting, which people were concerned, but there really wasn't much more that is seems to be happening on this score. And yet we have naval vessels of three NATO allies, because the French are helping the Greeks, standing opposite each other in the Eastern Med, a serious possibility of escalation.
It is extremely serious, and it also points to the weakness of the European Union, which is internally split over this issue, but not only over this one, but also over Libya, and also over its analysis about Putin. The split is mostly between France and Germany, and even though we see a lot of coziness between Merkel and Sarkozy, Merkel and Macron, recently, just this week, Merkel went to visit Macron in his Atlantic coast castle, and they worked together pretty well during the financial summit of the EU a few weeks back. Legal problems about the sea law and how far basically the Greek coastlines do go, and it's also about, well, definitely rights to explore natural resources, and then as a third layer, there's a competition of influence in the broader region, mostly in Libya and Egypt. France is definitely siding with Greece, and Germany is trying to keep the balance between both and trying to avoid a war. Merkel is intervening. She is talking to Erdogan. He respects her. There's a lot of leverage Germany has versus Turkey, mostly economic. But then again, Erdogan is not shy to hit back, mostly with refugees and opening the borders. So there is a lot at stake. Also, domestically, Merkel is vulnerable because of the refugees. She desperately needs to avoid another shockwave of migrants coming in from Syria. So it's a multi-level game here. And in the end, now they try to find a way out in a kind of secret negotiations which are taking place and which we don't know a lot about right now. But the solution might lie somewhere in sort of a legal in solving the problem legally, in terms of how to define the border issue at sea and how to distribute the resources which are assumed to be on the seaboard, the seafloor of the Mediterranean. That's a tough call because it's also a very an issue filled with pride and nationalism and all the bad ingredients which make conflicts even worse.
Karen, Secretary Pompeo was in Europe when this started to emerge, and he met, I believe, with the Greek foreign minister in Austria and the Turkish foreign minister in that visit in the Dominican Republic. Last I looked, it's probably closer to meet with the Turks in Europe than it would be in the Dominican Republic. But nevertheless, they met. Do we have a sense of where the U.S. thinks this conflict is going, and what role the U.S. might have in diffusing what could be a military confrontation between two NATO allies?
Well, I think as Stefan said, they have sent a warship there. And they have put out pretty tough statements on behalf of Greece. So I think that they have positioned themselves in that way. At the same time, though, you know, the Trump administration in particular has a weird relationship with Turkey, and you never can quite tell what's going to happen. You know, what is this basically about? On the surface, it's about energy. It's about gas under the Mediterranean, and the fact that different countries claim access to it. And but deeper than that, it's about the fact that the Turkish-Greek border is a lot of islands in the Aegean that in some cases are closer to Turkey than they are to Greece, but belong to Greece. It's about Cyprus and the difficulty there that's gone on for decades between Turkey and Greece. So the Americans are in an interesting place, and I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall in the conversation between Pompeo and the Turkish foreign minister, because the Trump administration, and particularly President Trump, even as officials lower down have taken tough positions against Turkey on a whole range of issues, President Trump has pulled back almost every time, pointing to his good relationship with President Erdogan, and has been very reluctant to actually do anything to put words behind, or to put actions behind those words.
Julian, we only have seconds left. Final word, any worry in the intelligence community that this may come to a clash of arms?
When we're talking about Greece and Turkey, there is always worry. Solutions in recent years have always pivoted around German intervention and Merkel's leadership. And she has been the one who has been able to resolve, at least temporarily, and facilitate deals. And as long as Germany is on the sidelines and France is leading, there is a worry that this gets worse and not better.
Well, I think it points to the centrality of Angela Merkel to so many of the issues that confront us, that we've discussed, whether it's Belarus or Navalny, or indeed the Greek and Turkish issues. That's the world this week. Thank you all the time we had to go through the conversation. Thank you, Julian, Karen, Stefan. Great to have you here. We'll be back next week. In the meantime, for all of you who are watching, tune in every Friday morning. And until then, have a great weekend and a good week. Thank you all.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Thank you.